Every month, a stranger transferred $1,000 to me for 7 years. I never knew who it was. But one day, a lawyer called. "Ma'am, your father's friend has passed away. He left you his entire fortune, $45 million. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought of myself as someone luck would find. That sounds dramatic, I know. But when you grow up the way I did, a rented house in Dayton, Ohio, a mother who worked double shifts at the hospital laundry, a father who died of a heart attack when I was 11 and left behind nothing but a handful of debt and a coffee-stained Bible. You learn early not to expect much. You learn to count what you have, not what's missing. And what I had by the time I was 34 was a decent enough life. I rented a 2-bedroom apartment on Maple Street, drove a 2009 Honda Civic with one broken AC vent, and worked as a medical billing coordinator at St. Vincent's Health Center. Not glamorous, not tragic either, just mine. I had a routine. I liked routines. Every weekday morning, I made coffee before 6, checked my emails, fed my cat, biscuit, and drove 20 minutes to work through the same 4 traffic lights. On weekends, I visited my mother, Carol, who'd moved into a small assisted living apartment after her knee replacement. I read, I cooked, I paid my bills on time and kept my savings account growing slowly, the way a plant grows when you water it carefully and don't expect too much. That was my life. Predictable, honest, mine. But underneath it, for 7 years, something had been quietly happening that I couldn't explain. It started in the spring of 2016. I was checking my bank account on a Tuesday evening. I did this obsessively back then, the way anxious people do when money is tight, and I noticed a deposit I hadn't made, $1,000, clean, round number. No description except a routing code and the words, "personal transfer." I assumed it was an error. I called the bank. They confirmed it was a legitimate electronic transfer from a private account, but they couldn't give me more information without a formal request. I waited for the bank to reverse it, the way you wait for a wrong package to be picked up from your porch. It never was. The next month, the same thing happened. $1,000. Same routing code. No name. I called the bank again. I filed a formal inquiry. They told me the account was registered under a private trust and the transfer was intentional. "The sender has authorized this," the representative said. "There's nothing irregular on our end, ma'am. I asked if I should return the money." There was a pause. "That would be your decision." I sat with that for a long time. Who sends a stranger $1,000 a month and leaves no name? My first instinct was that it was a mistake. Someone had the wrong account number and hadn't noticed yet. But after 3 months, then 6, then a year, that theory collapsed under its own weight. Nobody makes the same mistake for 12 consecutive months. This was deliberate, intentional, quiet. I tried everything I could think of. I hired a small-time private investigator for a few $100s. A retired cop named Dale Pruitt who smelled like cigarettes and spoke in half sentences. He hit the same wall I had. The trust was registered in Delaware, which meant layers of legal privacy protection. He gave me back my money and told me to just enjoy it. I didn't enjoy it. I kept it in a separate account, untouched, because spending it felt wrong. It felt like spending something borrowed. 7 years of deposits, 84 months, $84,000 sitting in a savings account I couldn't bring myself to touch. And then, on a Thursday morning in March 2023, my phone rang. The number was a 614 area code. Columbus, Ohio. A man's voice, formal and measured, like someone who'd practiced the sentence before dialing. Am I speaking with Sarah Mitchell? Yes. Ms. Mitchell, my name is Gerald Harmon. I'm an estate attorney with Harmon and Associates in Columbus. I'm calling regarding the estate of Mr. Richard Calloway, who passed away on February 28th of this year. The name meant nothing to me. I told him so. I understand, he said without surprise, as if he'd expected exactly that answer. Mr. Calloway was a close friend of your late father, Thomas Mitchell. He's named you as the sole primary beneficiary of his estate. I sat down. I didn't remember sitting, but suddenly I was in the kitchen chair, biscuit rubbing against my ankle. How much are we talking about? I asked. My voice was very calm. It surprises me still how calm it was. After taxes and legal fees, Ms. Mitchell, you stand to inherit approximately $45 million. I looked at the wall, at the small crack in the plaster near the window that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, at Biscuit, at my coffee cup, half empty, still steaming. Ms. Mitchell, are you there? Yes, I said. I'm here. But I wasn't, not really. The woman who'd answered that phone call, the one who counted traffic lights and saved bank errors she was afraid to spend, she was already gone. I asked Gerald Harmon if I could call him back, not because I needed time to think. My mind wasn't capable of thought in that moment, not real thought, just a kind of white static. I asked because I needed to hang up the phone and sit in my kitchen and breathe the same air I'd been breathing 5 minutes ago, before the world quietly rearranged itself around me. I called my mother first. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always did. Mom, I said, did Dad ever mention someone named Richard Calloway? There was a silence that told me everything before she spoke. Not a confused silence, a heavy one. Where did you hear that name? She asked. An attorney called me this morning. Richard Calloway died. He left me his estate. Another silence. Then, very quietly, oh, Sarah. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Something she'd been carrying. She told me what she knew, which wasn't much. Richard Calloway had been her husband's oldest friend. They'd grown up together in the same neighborhood in Columbus, gone to the same high school, drifted apart when my father moved to Dayton. They stayed in loose contact, Christmas cards, the occasional phone call. Richard had come to my father's funeral. My mother remembered him as a tall, quiet man in a gray suit who'd stood at the back of the room and hadn't spoken to anyone. He came up to me afterward, she said. He held both my hands and looked at me and said, Carol, I'm going to make sure Sarah is all right. I didn't know what he meant. I thought it was just something people say. But it wasn't something people say. It was a promise. And he'd kept it. 12 months a year for 7 years, without ever asking for acknowledgement or gratitude or even a thank you. I drove to Columbus the next morning. Gerald Harmon's office was in a brick building near the short north, neat and unassuming, the kind of place that didn't need to announce itself. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He shook my hand with both of his, the way people do when they're about to give you complicated news. He laid it out plainly. Richard Calloway had been a real estate developer. Old money compounded into new money over 4 decades of careful, deliberate work. No flash, no scandal, just work. He'd never married. He had 2 adult children from a brief relationship in the late 1980s. Marcus Calloway, 51, who ran a property management company in Columbus, and Diana Calloway Reese, 48, who lived in Scottsdale with her husband and managed a boutique interior design firm. Both had expected, in the way adult children often do, to be the primary beneficiaries. Richard had left them each $500,000. He left me everything else. He wrote a letter, Gerald said, sliding a sealed envelope across the desk. He asked that you read it privately. I read it in the car, parked on a side street with the engine off. Richard's handwriting was careful and slightly old-fashioned, the letters fully formed. "Sarah," he wrote, "your father was the best man I ever knew. When he died, I made a promise to myself that I would do what I could, quietly, without expectation. I never contacted you because I didn't want you to feel obligated or uncomfortable. I wanted you to live your life without feeling watched. I hope these years gave you something. I hope the years ahead give you more. You don't owe me anything. This is simply what I believed was right." I sat there for a long time, long enough that a parking enforcement officer walked past and gave me a look. What would you do with that? With the knowledge that someone you'd never met had watched over you in silence for 7 years, out of loyalty to a father you barely remembered. I didn't know whether to cry or to feel violated or to feel grateful. I felt all three, in no particular order, for several days. And then the calls from Marcus Calloway began. The first one came 4 days after my meeting with Gerald, a number I didn't recognize, a voice that was smooth but not warm, the voice of a man accustomed to negotiations. "Ms. Mitchell, I think we should talk." He was polite enough that first call. He expressed his condolences about his father. He said he respected that Richard had made certain decisions. He said he believed there was room for a reasonable arrangement. He used that phrase twice. Reasonable arrangement. I asked him what he meant. He said he'd prefer to discuss it in person. I declined. He called again 2 days later. This time, Diana was on the call as well, on speakerphone, her voice carrying the particular tight brightness of someone managing their emotions through their teeth. She said she was sure I was a lovely person. She said her father had clearly had deep affection for my family. She said, and this was the phrase that stayed with me, "You have to understand, Sarah, that we grew up in that house. We watched him build everything. We have a history there that a legal document doesn't capture." I understood exactly what she meant. She meant, "This should be ours, and you are in the way." I said I needed time to think. I hung up. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and I made a list, not of what I might lose, of what I needed to do to make sure I didn't. The $45 million was in probate. Gerald had explained that Marcus and Diana had already filed a formal contest of the Will E, citing, among other things, that their father had been in declining cognitive health in his final year and may not have been of sound mind when he updated his estate documents. It was a serious claim. It could drag on for a year, maybe longer. I was not going to let them take this from me. Not because of the money, though the money mattered, I won't pretend it didn't, but because Richard Calloway had spent 7 years honoring his word to a dead man, because he had quietly, without fanfare, decided I was worth protecting, and I was not going to let his children erase that. I needed a lawyer, my own, not Gerald who represented the estate, someone who worked for me alone. I opened my laptop. I started searching. The plan was simple then. Find the right attorney. Gather every piece of evidence that showed Richard had been of sound mind. Fight. I didn't know yet how personal the fight was going to become. I found Catherine Webb through a referral from Gerald Harmon, who was careful to explain that he could only suggest her name, not recommend her. Conflict of interest. But the way he said her name told me everything. Catherine Webb, he'd said, like you'd say the name of a tool you knew would work. She had an office in a converted Victorian house on 5th Street in Columbus. I drove back up on a Wednesday morning, told my supervisor at work I had a medical appointment, and sat across from a woman in her late 40s who wore no jewelry except small pearl earrings and had the sort of stillness that comes not from passivity but from absolute confidence in her own read of a situation. She listened to me without interrupting. She read the copy of the will Gerald had sent. She set it down and looked at me. "Have you signed anything with Marcus or Diana Calloway?" "No." "Have you made any verbal agreements with them? Acknowledged any claim of theirs in any way?" "No." "Good," she said. "Let's keep it that way." Catherine explained the legal landscape plainly. Marcus and Diana's contest rested on two arguments: that Richard lacked testamentary capacity when he amended his will 18 months before his death, and that the amendment had been made under undue influence, the implication being that someone had manipulated Richard into changing it. I asked who they were suggesting had done that. Catherine gave me a dry look. "You, Ms. Mitchell. They're suggesting it was you." I stared at her. I never even met the man. I know. That's going to be one of our stronger points. We spent 2 hours mapping the strategy. We needed 3 categories of evidence: medical records showing Richard's cognitive state in the period surrounding the will amendment, financial records showing the consistent and deliberate pattern of the monthly transfers, and personal correspondence demonstrating that Richard's support of me was long-standing and rational, not a sudden, confused impulse. I left her office with a list of things to do and a retainer agreement signed. I drove back to Dayton feeling, for the first time since Gerald's call, like I had a foothold. The first person I called was my mother. "Mom, do you still have the box from the funeral?" She knew exactly what I meant. There was a shoebox in the back of her closet that held every card, letter, and piece of paper related to my father's death. She'd never been able to throw it away. I drove to her apartment that Saturday and we went through it together, sitting on her narrow bed while the late afternoon light came through the curtains. There it was, a sympathy card postmarked Columbus, Ohio, April 2002. Tom was one of the finest people I've ever known. His family will not be forgotten. Richard. My mother touched the edge of the card carefully, the way you touch something old and fragile. "He meant it," she said quietly. "He really meant it." I photographed the card and sent it to Catherine that evening. But the past wasn't the only place we needed to look. Catherine's investigator, a methodical woman named Priya Nair who specialized in estate litigation, began pulling Richard's medical records through the proper legal channels. What she found within 10 days was not what Marcus and Diana's legal team was counting on. Richard had been seen by his primary care physician and a consulting neurologist in the 14 months before his death. The records showed mild age-related cognitive changes, the kind that appear in healthy 81-year-old men, but no dementia diagnosis, no documented confusion, no lapses in executive function. He had, in fact, attended 2 board meetings for his property trust in the year of the will amendment and had signed off on a significant commercial lease renewal. This was not the portrait of a man who didn't know what he was doing. Catherine called me on a Tuesday evening. "We have the medical records. Their capacity argument is in serious trouble." I sat down at my kitchen table. Outside, a neighbor's sprinkler was running in the dark. "Good," I said. "What's next?" "Next," Catherine said, "is that Marcus Calloway's attorney filed a motion this morning to delay the probate proceedings for 60 days. They want more time to gather evidence." I understood what that meant without her explaining it. They were stalling. The longer the estate sat in probate, the more expensive it became for everyone, and they were calculating, correctly, that I had limited resources to sustain a prolonged fight, an inheritance I couldn't yet touch, a legal battle I was paying for out of my own savings. They were betting I'd run out of money or nerve before they did. "Can we oppose the delay?" "Already filed," Catherine said. "And Sarah, something else. My investigator found a letter." Priya had located it through the estate's document archive, a letter Richard had written to his own attorney, Gerald Harmon, 2 years before his death. It was 4 pages, single-spaced. In it, Richard explained, with complete clarity and sequential logic, the full history of his relationship with my father, the reason he had established the anonymous monthly transfers, and, critically, his decision to name me as his primary heir. He had dated it. He had signed it. And at the bottom, in Gerald's handwriting, was a notation. "Client reviewed and confirmed, witnessed by undersigned." Catherine read me the key passage over the phone. Richard had written, "Sarah Mitchell has never known of my involvement, and I have kept it that way deliberately. My intention is not to create dependency, but to provide a quiet floor beneath her life, as Thomas would have done had he lived. She is not a stranger to me. She's the daughter of my oldest friend, and that is sufficient reason." I had to put the phone down for a moment. Sufficient reason. After 7 years, after $84,000 sent in silence, after a $45 million estate, sufficient reason. I picked the phone back up. "That letter," I said, "that's our case, isn't it?" "A significant part of it," Catherine said. "Yes." I hung up and sat in the silence of my apartment and thought about a tall, quiet man in a gray suit standing at the back of a funeral room in 2002, holding my mother's hands and making a promise he never once broke. I thought about Marcus Calloway's voice on the phone. Reasonable arrangement. I thought, no, not reasonable. Not an arrangement. The full thing. Every bit of it. Catherine filed our opposition to the delay motion on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, Marcus Calloway had a new approach. He showed up at my apartment. I hadn't given him my address. That was the first thing I thought when I opened the door and saw him standing on my landing. How does he know where I live? He was tall in the way his father must have been, but where Richard's height, from my mother's description, had been quiet and contained, Marcus wore his like a statement. He was dressed in a jacket and open-collar shirt, and he smiled at me with the particular smile of a man who believes that smiling is a form of leverage. "Sarah," he said, as though we were old friends. "I was in Dayton. I thought I'd stop by." Nobody is just in Dayton. Dayton is not a city people pass through on their way somewhere. I stepped outside and pulled the door mostly shut behind me. I did not invite him in. "You shouldn't have come here," I said. "I just wanted to talk, without the lawyers." He spread his hands, a gesture of openness. "All of this, it's gotten more adversarial than I intended." I looked at him for a moment. How do you respond to a man who files a legal motion accusing you of manipulating a dying man and then shows up at your door and calls the situation more adversarial than intended? "We have attorneys for a reason," I said. "You should contact Catherine Webb's office." His smile held, but something shifted underneath it. "I want you to understand something. My father built that estate over 40 years. My sister and I were part of that life. We attended every Christmas dinner, every board meeting, "I know," I said. "You received $500,000 each. That's what your father decided you should have." The smile stopped. My father was not well. He was. His neurologist's records suggest otherwise, I said. "Goodbye, Marcus." I went inside and locked the door. My hands were shaking. I called Catherine immediately. She was not surprised. She told me to document the visit, time, duration, what was said, and that if he appeared again, it would constitute harassment. She said she'd be filing a formal notice with his attorney, but Marcus wasn't done. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a printed copy of a series of text messages between my father and Richard Calloway from the early 2000s. I didn't know how they'd obtained them or if they were even real, accompanied by a handwritten note on Marcus's company letterhead. The note said, in part, "These messages suggest your father borrowed a significant sum from Richard Calloway prior to his death that was never repaid. As primary beneficiary, you may be legally liable for this debt. Our attorneys are prepared to pursue this in parallel with the estate proceedings." It was a threat, a specific, calculated one. I photographed everything and sent it to Catherine. She called me that evening. "It's a pressure tactic. Debt liability doesn't transfer to heirs in this way under Ohio law, if any such debt even existed, which we have no evidence of. They're trying to make you afraid." "It's working," I admitted. "That's fine," she said. "Let it work a little, as long as it doesn't change what you do next." What I did next was nothing. Not because I had no move to make, but because Catherine's move was already in play. We had submitted a formal request for sanction against Marcus's legal team for the unannounced contact, and we had filed a counter motion in the probate court challenging the validity of their capacity argument and presenting Richard's letter to Gerald Harmon as primary documentary evidence of testamentary clarity. The judge denied Marcus's delay motion. The probate proceedings would continue on schedule. Diana called me that night. She didn't bother with warmth this time. "You think you're protecting something," she said. "You're not. You're embarrassing yourself and destroying something my father built. You didn't know him. You didn't love him. You have no right to any of this." I let her finish. Then I said, "Diana, your father wrote 4 pages explaining exactly why he made this decision. I didn't write those pages. He did." She hung up. I sat in my apartment until midnight, unable to sleep. Biscuit was on my lap. Outside, the city was quiet. I thought about the 93 days that had passed since Gerald Harmon's call, and about the woman I'd been before it, counting traffic lights and watering her plant carefully and not expecting too much. Had she been smaller then, or just safer? I booked 3 days off from work the following week. I drove to my mother's apartment and slept in the narrow extra bed and watched old movies with her and ate her soup and let her brush my hair the way she used to when I was sick as a child. I didn't talk much about the case. I talked about my father, what she remembered about him, what made her laugh about him, who he'd been before the hospital and the debt and the heart attack at 43. She showed me a photograph I'd never seen. 2 young men, maybe 22, 23, standing in front of a beat-up Ford truck, both grinning. One was my father. The other, taller, darker hair. I didn't recognize until my mother pointed. "That's Richard," she said. He was smiling in the photograph. A real smile, unguarded, the kind you only give to someone you trust completely. I put the photograph in my bag. I drove home on Sunday evening through the familiar 4 traffic lights, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Gerald's call. Not fear, not uncertainty. Ready. The offer came through the attorneys, as offers do when people want to pretend they're being professional. It was a Tuesday. Catherine called me at 10 in the morning with the specifics. Marcus and Diana's legal team had submitted a formal settlement proposal. Sarah Mitchell would withdraw from the estate proceedings and sign a full release of all claims in exchange for a lump sum payment of $2 million. $2 million. Do you know what I did when Catherine told me that number? I didn't gasp. I didn't feel the pull of it the way I might have in another life. The woman with the broken AC vent and the untouched savings account. I felt something else instead. Something cold and clear and almost geometrical. I recognized the number for what it was. Not a gesture of goodwill, but a calculation. They believed they could settle me for less than it would cost them to lose. They had done the math and decided I had a price. "Tell them no," I said. Catherine paused. "Sarah, $2 million is not what Richard intended. Tell them no." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right, I'll communicate our rejection." I hung up and went back to my desk at work. I had 3 prior authorizations to review before noon. I reviewed them. That was the thing about the weeks that followed. My life didn't stop being my life. I still went to work. I still drove the same 4 traffic lights. I still visited my mother on weekends and fed Biscuit every morning. The case was enormous and real and pressing, but it existed in a kind of parallel channel alongside my ordinary days. And I found I didn't want to collapse the two together. The ordinary days were the thing I was fighting to protect in a way. Not just an inheritance, a life, but I was not going through it alone. There was a woman at my office named Renée Dupont. She'd been at St. Vincent's longer than anyone, 6 years to my 3, and she had the kind of specific, unsentimental kindness that doesn't get celebrated enough. She'd noticed I was quieter than usual, thinner, spending lunch breaks on the phone with my face turned toward the window. One Friday, she appeared at my cubicle with 2 cups of coffee and a look that didn't invite deflection. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me." I told her. Not everything, not the numbers, not the legal details, but the shape of it. A man I'd never met had left me something substantial. His children were contesting it. I was in the middle of something I hadn't asked for. Renée listened without interrupting, which is a rare skill. Then she said, "You're not going to give in." It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "Good, don't." She handed me a coffee. "What do you need?" That question undid me more than any of the threats had. What do you need? I hadn't realized until she asked it how long I'd been navigating everything by the math of what I could handle alone. I needed someone to know. I needed someone who wasn't my attorney or my mother, who had her own fear wrapped around this. I could hear it every time we talked. To simply know and to not be afraid alongside me. Renée knew, and she wasn't afraid. Over the following 2 weeks, she became the person I texted when something happened. Not to process it, not to be talked off a ledge, but simply to have a witness. She'd send back short replies. "Good. Hold the line, don't let them." She gave me a small copper bracelet that had been her grandmother's. "For when you're in the room with them," she said, "so you remember there's someone outside the room who's on your side." I wore it every day. My mother helped in her own way. She found 2 more cards from Richard, both from the years after my father's death, both addressed to her, both containing some variant of the same quiet message. I am keeping my promise. Catherine added them to our evidence file, and Priya, our investigator, found something else. Testimony from 2 of Richard's longtime business associates who were willing to speak to his character and mental sharpness in the year before his death. One of them, a man named Douglas Chow, had played chess with Richard every Thursday afternoon until 6 weeks before his death. "His game didn't slip," Douglas said when Priya interviewed him. "If anything, he was sharper than ever. He beat me every single time." I called Catherine on a Wednesday evening to review where we stood. The medical records, Richard's letter to Gerald, my father's sympathy card, my mother's cards, the chess partner, the 2 business associates, And the photograph, the one of two young men in front of a Ford truck. I'd had it framed. It sat on my kitchen counter now next to the coffee maker. "Where are they?" I asked. "Marcus and Diana. What are they doing?" "Watching," Catherine said. "Their attorney hasn't filed anything new. They're waiting to see what we do next." Let them watch, I thought. Watching costs attention. Attention pulls energy away from strategy. Every day they spent watching me and calculating their next move was a day they weren't building a stronger case. I went to bed that night and slept for 7 hours straight. The first full night's sleep I'd had in 3 weeks. Ready, I had said to myself the Sunday I drove home from my mother's, and I meant it. They came on a Saturday. I was at home, which was unusual. I'd taken to spending Saturdays at my mother's lately. But that morning I'd stayed in, cleaning, listening to the radio, trying to be ordinary for a few hours. When the knock came at my door and I opened it to find both Marcus and Diana Calloway standing on my landing, I understood immediately that this was not a coincidence. They knew my schedule. They knew I was home. Diana had brought flowers, white and yellow, lilies and something smaller that I didn't recognize. She held them at her side like a prop she'd been told to carry. "We should have done this weeks ago," she said. "We owe you an apology, Sarah. Can we come in?" I looked at the flowers, then at Marcus, who was standing slightly behind and to the left of his sister, his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling remorse. I thought of Renee and the bracelet on my wrist. "You can say what you came to say here," I said. Diana's composure flickered, just for a second, and then reset. "Of course. She glanced at Marcus. "We've been grieving. Our father just died, and we handled ourselves badly." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. I meant it. However complicated Richard's children were, they had lost a father. "Thank you." She stepped forward as though proximity itself was part of the strategy. "Sarah, we don't want this to continue. The court process, the attorneys, the cost of all of it to both sides. Dad wouldn't have wanted this." "Then perhaps," I said, "his will should have been different." A pause. Marcus spoke for the first time. "There's a way to resolve this without further litigation. We've talked to our attorneys. We're prepared to offer you $2.5 million of full and final settlement, and we'd like to." "I already declined $2 million, I said. "The answer to 2.5 is the same." Something changed in Marcus then. The remorse expression dropped like a coat being shrugged off. He stepped forward past Diana. "You need to think about what you're doing," he said. His voice was lower, not threatening exactly, not yet, but the surface warmth was gone. "You're a billing coordinator. You make what, $50,000 a year? You're paying your attorney out of savings. You can sustain this for, what, another 4 months? 6? We can do this for 3 years. We have the resources." "Is that a threat, Marcus?" "It's a reality." Diana touched his arm, a small corrective gesture, and he stepped back. She turned to me and her voice shifted into something softer, practiced, but carrying real weight underneath it. "Sarah, we grew up in that house. Every summer, every Christmas. We helped him when he was sick. Diana flew to Columbus 12 times in his last year. 12 times. Her voice caught just slightly in the right place. You never visited. You never called. You didn't even know his name until an attorney told you. How is that fair? How does that feel right to you?" And here was the thing. It didn't feel right. Not in the way she meant it, but in some older, simpler way. I understood what she was saying. They had loved him. They had been present. and I had been, until 2 months ago, a stranger who received anonymous money. But Richard had made his choice with full knowledge of all of those facts. "I understand why you're angry," I said. "I would be too. But your father made his decision. He documented it. He thought about it for years. I'm not going to dishonor that because it's inconvenient." "Inconvenient," Diana said, and the softness left her voice like a light switching off. "You think this is inconvenient for us?" "I think you're in pain," I said. "I think the pain is real. I think it still doesn't change anything." Marcus looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. This is the kind of moment I've thought since, where character gets decided, not in crisis, in the quiet, uncomfortable seconds when you could make something go away by simply being less than you intended to be. "You're making a serious mistake," he said quietly. "Goodbye," I said. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway with my back against it and listened to their footsteps on the landing, then on the stairs, then the sound of a car door, then nothing. My hands were shaking again, but differently than before. Last time, it had been adrenaline and fear. This time, it was something like the shaking that happens after you've lifted something very heavy and put it down. The vibration of exertion, not of fear. Were they right about the resources? Yes. They had more money than I did, and this could drag on, and there was no guarantee the judge would rule in my favor, and I might spend 2 years fighting and still walk away with nothing. Was I afraid of that? Yes. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But here's the thing about fear. The thing I learned in those months. It doesn't have to be the loudest thing in the room. It can sit in the corner and hum while you decide what to do next. It doesn't have to drive. I picked up my phone and texted Renee. They came. I said no. Still standing. She replied in under a minute. "Of course you are. Dinner Tuesday?" "Yes," I wrote back. Then I went to the kitchen and stood in front of the framed photograph on the counter. 2 young men, a Ford truck, real smiles. "I've got it," I said to the photograph, to my father, to Richard, to whoever was listening. Then I made lunch. The hearing was set for a Thursday in October. I drove to Columbus the night before and stayed at a small hotel 3 blocks from the courthouse. I ordered room service, soup, toast, nothing heavy, and went through the documents with Catherine until 9 o'clock. She had organized everything into a clean, sequential narrative. Richard's letter to Gerald Harmon, the medical records, the testimony from Douglas Chow and the 2 business associates, my mother's cards, the sympathy card from 2002, the bank records showing 84 months of consistent, deliberate transfers. "You don't need to say much," Catherine told me as she was leaving. "Let the evidence do the work. If opposing counsel addresses you directly, answer briefly and accurately. No elaboration, no emotion." "What about Marcus? Will he testify?" "He's listed as a witness for their side." She paused at the door. "He's going to perform, Sarah. He's going to be very convincing about how much he loved his father and how concerned he was about his mental state. You let me handle him." I went to bed at 10 and slept 5 hours. Not enough, but better than I'd expected. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Dark wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the particular institutional quiet of a place where serious things are decided routinely. Judge Patricia Okafor was in her mid-50s with a direct, unhurried manner. She had reviewed the preliminary filings. She was not, it was clear, a judge who appreciated theater. Marcus and Diana sat at the opposing table with their 2 attorneys. Marcus was dressed impeccably, charcoal suit, dark tie, the kind of groomed composure that announces itself as composure. Diana sat with her hands folded on the table. She had dark circles under her eyes that her makeup didn't entirely conceal. She looked, for the first time, like someone who was actually suffering rather than performing suffering, and I felt a complicated stab of something, not sympathy exactly, recognition. The first 2 hours were procedural. Both sides presented their documented evidence. Catherine introduced Richard's letter to Gerald Harmon formally into the record. The opposing attorney objected on grounds of hearsay. The judge overruled, citing that the letter was a documented statement of testamentary intent, witnessed and dated. I watched Marcus's jaw tighten. Then the medical testimony. Priya had worked with a forensic neurologist, Dr. Elena Marsh, who reviewed Richard's records and submitted a written expert opinion. Mr. Calloway demonstrated no clinical evidence of cognitive impairment inconsistent with typical aging. His documented decision-making in the 12 months prior to the will amendment reflects preserved executive function and capacity for complex judgment. Dr. Marsh was not called to testify in person. Her written opinion was entered into evidence. The opposing side had their own expert, a Dr. Ferris, who testified that Richard's age and certain documented lapses in short-term memory could have impaired his judgment. Catherine cross-examined him calmly. "Doctor, in your expert opinion, did Richard Calloway lack testamentary capacity? He may have experienced difficulty. That wasn't my question. Did he lack capacity? Yes or no?" A pause. "I cannot state with certainty that he lacked capacity." "Thank you," Catherine said. Nothing further. Then Marcus took the stand. He was good. I'll give him that. He spoke about his father with genuine warmth. The Christmas mornings, the business advice, the phone calls. He said he'd noticed his father becoming more isolated in his final years, more susceptible to emotional appeals. He said that when Richard had mentioned a promise I made to an old friend, Marcus had assumed it was sentiment, not a legal arrangement. He said, and here he paused, for effect, "I never imagined he would give everything to a stranger. That's not the man I knew." Catherine rose. "Mr. Calloway, you mentioned your father became more isolated in his final years. Can you give me a specific example of a social engagement he declined?" A hesitation. "He stopped attending his investment club." "When was that?" "I believe," a pause, "around 2021, perhaps." Catherine placed a document on the podium. "This is a record from the Columbus Real Estate Investment Association, showing your father in attendance at 11 of 12 meetings in 2022 and all 6 meetings in the first half of 2023, the year of his death. Is it possible you're mistaken about the timeline?" "I may have the date wrong." "Is it possible you have other facts wrong as well, Mr. Calloway?" Objection from opposing counsel. Sustained. But the moment had already happened. I watched Marcus recalibrate, subtly but visibly. The composed surface had developed a hairline crack. "You testified that you were unaware of any ongoing financial support your father provided to the Mitchell family. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Were you aware that your father made 84 consecutive monthly transfers to Ms. Mitchell's account over 7 years?" "I was not." "At any point in those 7 years, did your father discuss his estate plans with you in detail?" "We discussed." Marcus stopped. "He said he intended to take care of us." "He did take care of you. He left you each $500,000. Did he ever explicitly tell you that you would be his sole heirs?" A longer pause this time. "Not in those words." "In what words, Mr. Calloway?" He implied, not stated." Catherine turned a page. "I have here a letter your father wrote to his attorney 2 years before his death. In it, he states, and I quote, 'I listened as she read the line I already knew by heart. Sarah Mitchell has never known of my involvement, and I have kept it that way deliberately.'" The courtroom was very quiet. "Mr. Calloway, does this sound like the writing of a man who was confused about his intentions?" Marcus looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. "I have nothing further," Catherine said. Diana was called next. She was quieter than her brother, more careful, more controlled, but near the end of Catherine's cross-examination, something gave way. "Ms. Calloway Reese, you mentioned you visited your father 12 times in his final year. Was it during those visits that you first became aware he intended to make significant charitable contributions outside the family?" "It's not charitable." "I'm sorry, I misspoke. Outside of family transfers. Was that when you became aware?" "I became aware when Gerald Harmon called me after my father's death." "So your father never discussed these plans with you directly?" "No." "Did he ever explain why?" Diana looked at Catherine. Then, unexpectedly, she looked at me. It was the first time our eyes had met directly since they'd come to my apartment. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had expected a different ending to a different story, and finding herself in this one instead was simply exhausting. "No," she said quietly. "He didn't explain." Catherine let that sit for a moment. Then she sat down. The judge thanked both sides and informed the courtroom that she would review all submitted evidence and issue a ruling within 14 days. I walked out into the October sunlight and sat on a bench outside the courthouse and called my mother. "It went well," I said. "I think it went well." She started to cry very quietly, the way she cried, without drama, without sound, just the specific quality of silence that tells you someone is weeping. "Dad would be so proud of you," she said. I pressed my hand flat against the bench beside me. Concrete, cold, solid. "I know," I said. "I think he'd be proud of Richard, too." The ruling came on a Monday, 14 days exactly. Catherine called me at 7:15 in the morning, which meant she'd already read it and needed a moment before she told me. That 7:15 call, before I'd finished my first cup of coffee, with Biscuit watching me from the kitchen counter and the morning light coming through the window, I have thought about that moment more than almost any other in this story. The last moment before I knew for certain. "Sarah," Catherine said, "we won." I put the coffee cup down very carefully. Judge Patricia Okafor had ruled in my favor on all primary counts. The will was upheld in full. The court found no credible evidence that Richard Calloway lacked testamentary capacity. His medical records, witnessed correspondence, and documented professional activities demonstrated consistent, unimpaired judgment. The court further found that the claim of undue influence was unsupported by any evidence of contact between the beneficiary and the decedent, a particularly notable absence given that the plaintiff's theory required Ms. Mitchell to have influenced a man she had never met. Catherine filed the confirmation of judgment with the probate court that same afternoon. The estate began the formal transfer process. It was over. Marcus's attorney filed a notice of appeal within a week. I called Catherine the morning I heard. "Can they win?" "They can file. Filing is easy." Her voice was unhurried. "An appeal requires demonstrating legal error. Not that they disagree with the outcome. They have no grounds." She was right. The appeals court dismissed the challenge in 53 days. But the damage to Marcus and Diana had already accumulated in layers no ruling could undo. The legal fees from 20 months of litigation had cost them substantially. Marcus had taken on debt to sustain the fight, debt secured partly against his property management company. Their names had appeared in the Columbus business press, not prominently, but in the way that quietly damages a man for whom reputation is infrastructure. Gerald Harmon called me the week after the appeal's dismissal and walked me through the final numbers. After taxes, after fees, after the distributions to Marcus and Diana, my share of Richard Calloway's estate was $44.7 million. I was sitting in my Maple Street apartment when he told me that. The broken AC vent was still there. I hadn't fixed it. I hadn't known what to fix first. "Gerald," I said. "What was he like?" "Day to day." "Quiet," Gerald said. He thought very carefully before he spoke. He never forgot a commitment he'd made. A pause. "He talked about your father occasionally. When he did, it was with considerable warmth." I called Renee. "We won," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I know." "How did you know?" "Because you were always going to." I called my mother. She cried, and this time so did I. Properly. The real kind. The kind that's about more than the immediate moment. About my father, who'd been loved by Richard so completely that the love outlasted both of them. About 7 years of deposits I'd been afraid to spend. About a man in a gray suit standing at the back of a room in 2002, making a promise. "He kept it," I said. "He kept it," she agreed. I did not rush. The first thing I did was move my mother. A ground-floor condo in Dayton, a real kitchen, a garden. She cried when she saw it. I established the Callaway Mitchell Foundation the following spring, both names on it because the story required both. It funded families navigating health crises and scholarships for children who'd lost a breadwinner early. Children like me at 11. I bought a brick colonial in Columbus, Richard's city, which felt right. The photograph of my father and Richard hangs in the hallway. Visitors always stop to look at it. Marcus's company collapsed under legal debt. He sold it at a loss. Diana's marriage didn't survive what the proceedings had revealed about her. She relocated to Phoenix. Most of my energy went forward. A scholarship letter from a girl in Cleveland. My mother in her garden. Renee visiting. Talking for hours about nothing important. Douglas Chow on Thursdays, teaching me chess. He beat me every time. I didn't mind.